Okay, let's talk a little bit about this whole concept of having an exit strategy and building a business to sell. And let's talk about why it's so important. You know, it's interesting, when you start a business, I think everybody is typically so excited and caught up in kind of the dream of having your own business, and you think it through enough that it's a valid business, you want to make a handsome living to support yourself and your family, and probably, hopefully, make a lot of money. But you don't really think about what you're going to do in the end. And I don't think most people have the foresight to start the business with the intent of selling it. And really, if you think about it, everybody should do that. Every business owner should do that. You should have the end game in mind. So I would say that, you know, most people don't do that, but it is quite important. So you want to build your business thinking about who might buy it someday. How will my business appeal to a buyer? And so that then we get into, primarily, let's talk about landscape contracting. And what's selling today, and this has been the case for many years really, and if you think about one of our national companies that just sold, Brickman, which sold for $1.6 billion, that was a pure landscape maintenance, reoccurring revenue model. And that is what buyers want. So when you think about reoccurring revenue, today that usually means commercial landscape maintenance. It could be residential landscape maintenance. Could be irrigation management. And lawn care. Those are the ones that are most prevalent today. So then if you narrow it down a little more, the prevalence of buyers today want commercial landscape maintenance. They're a little nervous about residential landscape maintenance. They're a little nervous about anything residential, actually, because they think, and it's probably true, somewhat true, that residential revenue will follow the course of the economy. So as we follow this, it's been historically every 7 years, an economic cycle, they think when we, you know, in the recession times, if it's residential, people will cut their landscape maintenance service. They'll do it themselves. They'll fix their own sprinklers. They'll put their own holiday decor up. And there's truth to that, I think. Business to business, commercial landscape maintenance, in difficult times, well, let me back up. The property manager's not going to eliminate the commercial landscape maintenance. The building owner's not going to eliminate that. It's going to be done. Might be some pressure on pricing, but that business is going to be there. And in difficult times, image-wise, it's more important for the commercial building to look good than in good times. So that business is a lot more stable. Then they also like all the additional revenue that comes with it. So on our market here in Colorado, that would typically be flowers, snow removal, irrigation, enhancements, in maybe holiday decor. So you get this core contract and this additional revenue comes. That's very sustainable. It renews, the revenue renews. You can kind of bank, you have a history of how much somebody spends in all these other service lines. So it's very predictable. So when you go to sell that, a buyer in their due diligence, they can see all that and they like that a lot. What's not selling today is construction, commercial landscape installation. I can't remember when one sold. I'm sure they have, but it's small, and I was in that business. You can do very well in that business, but people, they're nervous about it. Follows the cycle of the economy, like residential, and it's viewed as high risk, low margin revenue. And then really, what are you buying? You're buying backlog. So buyers are not willing to pay much for that. There are some strategic buyers in our industry that have commercial installation as their core business, and they probably would be a potential buyer, but they're not going to pay any kind of premium for it. So that's kind of a tough pill to swallow if you're in that business. But you can do your own research on that, and you'll see that that is not a real viable seller's market and has not been for quite a while. So then back to residential, what's not selling today? The bigger the design build residential company, the more difficult to sell. Because the bigger it becomes, this is kind of a dichotomy, kind of a contradiction, because if you're real good at what you do, it would be logical that you would grow your business, but you start to eliminate buyers. There are no private equity firms to date that have bought any design build firms. So normally you're going to sell to your employees, possibly to a competitor, but when you get to a certain size and your sale price becomes, multiple $1 million. I mean, if you're a $10 million design build company and you're going to sell for, who knows, but call it $5 million, you've eliminated most buyers. If you're a $1 or $2 million residential design build firm, then that, there are people out there that will buy that. They'll buy that as a career. One of your competitors will buy that, quite frankly, to get rid of you, as a tough competitor. And they'll be happy to get your people and your equipment, your assets. But those become more difficult. Another really viable business, as I mentioned earlier, is lawn care. And that can be a really nice business and very coveted by buyers. They can scale that up. They can make that bigger. Somebody would buy, a good-sized company in Denver and go buy some smaller companies to buy market share and eliminate competition. That's the classic reoccurring revenue. Now, it's a little subject to the economy, but with 2 income earners today, a lot of people are still willing to pay for that service. And that service doesn't really cost that much. There's a good franchise out of Canada called Weedman that is fairly large. Last I knew, about $120 million. And those businesses today will sell for 80 cents to $1.20 of revenue. So to give you an example, I have a friend in Ohio that does about $1.5 million in residential lawn care. He has, I think, about 12 trucks. So it's 1 man per truck, 12 employees, has a supervisor, I think just 1 key supervisor, and an interesting sales model that they use there. But his business today will sell for $1.2 to about $1.8 million. So this average, you can call it 1.5 dollar for dollar. I mean, that's a pretty nice business. And there are people, there's quite a few buyers, potential buyers, because they're stepping right into a simple business model, not a lot of employees, fairly profitable, easy to grow. So that's a pretty nice business. So that's one to consider if you're thinking about going into the green industry. When you're thinking about your business and thinking about selling it, one thing to think about is estate planning. It's always a good time to do estate planning. It's particularly attractive right now. The gift and estate tax has been unified at $5.3 million per spouse. So for a husband and wife, if you have a $10 million estate and you title your assets properly, call it 50-50, you can almost pass assets estate free if you had a $10 million estate. So you can also use this to gift stock. If it's a family business, you could gift to your children. So while you're formulating your exit strategy and ultimately thinking about selling one day, don't forget succession and estate planning. It's really important. If you don't do it and something catastrophic happens, like you pass away unexpectedly, it's a little bit of a mess. So you ought to be on that sooner than later. Let's talk about the size of your business a little bit. If you're a smaller business, call it under 3 million. It doesn't matter what your model is, but if you're under 3 million, you might have a key manager or two that you sell to. But more typically, you're probably going to sell to a competitor. And again, considered a strategic buyer, and they're looking to buy market share, eliminate you as a tough competitor, get your people, get your revenue, get your clients. That's really their goal. But so when that happens, that's usually a larger company buying a smaller company, and they're not that interested in the quality of your IT. You know, they want processes and procedures, but they're not going to discount you if you're a little lax in that area. But if you're bigger, you're going to attract a different buyer. So let's say you're going to attract a private equity firm. If you're 5 to 10 million, they will expect processes and procedures. They'll expect a good IT system. They will expect very key management employees. They will hope that you stay for the transition, but they're going to assume you won't. Worst case scenario, you leave. They need somebody to run the business. They're not going to run it. So it's really important that you invest in your people along the way. So don't underestimate that. So your processes, your procedures, things like routing software, accounting, integrated accounting and job cost, everything as tight as it can be, a multitasking staff, a really key number 2 and number 3 person, well-trained, good account managers, a solid sales and sales management team. They're going to look for all those things. So now that's a different animal. You know, now you're a bigger business, and you need to have focused on all these things. So your mindset ought to be, I want to be best of class. So I have this attitude that in our industry, and in most industries, if you really think about it, most companies are not best of class. They're average. And they're in with the pack. You know, there's 10 people that do the same thing, that compete against each other every week. And in most markets, there's some key player that has risen to the top because they do it differently, they do it better, they've invested in all the things I just talked about, and they can set the price bar a little higher. They're coveted by their customers. If they're maintenance, they renew at 95% or better. In this market, they're better than 10% profit. So so when somebody comes into a market, a buyer, and you're a landscape contractor and you don't know they're coming because they're doing the behind the scenes research, they're going to land on that best of class company before they land on yours. If they do come to you, they're going to discount you for having weaknesses. So that other best of class company is going to sell for a higher multiple of EBITDA than you will. Now, that isn't terrible, but just be aware, if you're in that situation, you will sell for less than you could have if you had invested in your business properly. So when you're doing this, one thing to think about is, in a real world, there's a contractor in the East that sold to one of the national companies probably 10 years ago now, maybe 12. And they're back in the industry, and my guess is this year they do $80 million in revenue. They have just a solid management team, an amazing team. And their motto is they measure everything. Everything they do, they measure. How much fuel they use, how tight their routes are, how many average miles per year on their trucks. They're a maintenance and a commercial installer. Their average hourly wage. They just look at everything and measure everything. They're always focused on driving profit to the bottom line. So it's those kind of companies that sell for the best price. And it's not easy to build that, but it's buildable. There are people that do it. So if you put your mind to it, it can be done. Okay, so you've got your business. You're working on an exit strategy. Maybe you've retained somebody to help you, and I would recommend that. But you're working on it, and when it gets right down to it, you know, you've made money along the way, and you're planning your retirement. So unless you've earned enough money along the way, you need to sell your company for as much as you can to fund your retirement. So now we're talking about money, just plain, simple money. And you're selling your company to fund retirement, which is typically for you and a spouse, and then to fund your lifestyle. So people don't like to talk about money. It's a little uncomfortable because it gets to this thing about you don't have enough, and most people don't. So here's a fact. Right now, there are 78 million baby boomer, my generation, at the age approaching retirement. I'm 58 in June, so they're getting close, and they're ready. They don't have enough money. 70 million, it's estimated by economists, do not have enough money to retire. So that is a sad state of affairs for those 70 million people. So you got to have money in your mind. It's not all about money, but here's the bottom line about money. You just have to have a certain amount of it to live a good life. And you need to plan, if you're going to retire in your 60s, you got to plan to live 30 years. That's a third of your life. With life expectancies today, that's 30 years. If you retire at 60, 65, you got to plan to live to 90 to 95 years old. That takes a lot of money. But the thing is, you've worked so hard building your business and funding your lifestyle along the way that you want to keep that. You don't want to cut back on your lifestyle. You're in retirement. You want to live a good life. So the whole thing for me about living a good life is it's a life without compromise. So there's compromise and no compromise. And everybody's lifestyle is different. So an example, mine is we have a second home. And we like to travel a lot. And I happen to like cars, and I like fast cars, so they're kind of expensive. So for me, I've got to have enough money to fund my passions. So you all know what your passions are. You need to keep that really in the forefront of your mind. You got to think about, how much money will I need in retirement? How much do I have? What will my business sell for? And is it enough? And if it's not enough, you need to change your business, make it better, change your model so that you can sell it for enough to retire and have a good life and an uncompromising life. So it's all very doable, and you have time, but you need to get your arms around all of this and think all this through so that you don't want to be one of the 70 million baby boomers today that don't have enough money to retire.